Flight 617 from Los Angeles to New York departed at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, climbing through clear California skies into the setting sun. Aaron settled into his seat in 14B, preparing for the cross-country journey with his laptop and noise-canceling headphones. The plane was nearly full, mostly business travelers and a few families scattered throughout the cabin. Everything seemed routine as the flight attendants completed their service preparations, and the aircraft reached cruising altitude over the Nevada desert. Nobody could have predicted that in 90 minutes this ordinary flight would become the scene of one of the most disturbing discoveries in commercial aviation history. Flight attendant Michelle Park moved through the cabin during the initial beverage service, her practiced smile in place as she handed out drinks and snacks. In her 8 years of flying, Michelle had experienced almost everything: medical emergencies, unruly passengers, equipment failures, but she approached each flight with professional optimism. Tonight seemed unremarkable. Passengers were settled, quiet, absorbed in their books and screens. The captain had announced smooth flying conditions ahead. Michelle allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking this would be an easy coast-to-coast run. But 3 rows ahead of Aaron, in seat 11C, a woman named Lisa Martinez sat rigid with anxiety that had nothing to do with flying. Lisa was 34 years old, traveling alone, and desperately hoping that the decision she'd made 2 hours ago wouldn't be discovered before she reached New York. In the overhead bin directly above her seat, hidden beneath her large roller suitcase and carefully wrapped in blankets to muffle any sound, was her 18-month-old son, Christopher. Lisa had smuggled her toddler onto the plane in the overhead compartment because she couldn't afford a ticket for him and was fleeing an abusive situation in Los Angeles. In her panicked, desperate mind, this had seemed like the only option. Now at 37,000 feet, she was beginning to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. Aaron noticed the woman in 11C seemed unusually tense. She kept glancing up at the overhead bin above her seat, her hands clenched together, her breathing rapid. He thought maybe she was a nervous flyer and returned his attention to his laptop. But Michelle, trained to notice passenger distress, made a mental note to check on the woman later. Something about her anxiety seemed different from typical flight nervousness. There was a quality of guilt or fear that Michelle couldn't quite identify but recognized as worth monitoring. 90 minutes into the flight, as the plane crossed into Colorado airspace, the smooth ride ended abruptly. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tension evident. "Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately. We're encountering unexpected severe turbulence." Before Michelle could reach her jump seat, the plane dropped violently. Passengers screamed as they were thrown against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open, spilling luggage and bags into the aisles. The aircraft bucked and shook, caught in clear air turbulence that hadn't appeared on any weather radar. Michelle grabbed a seat back to keep from falling as the plane continued its violent shaking. Bags and debris flew through the cabin. A laptop smashed into the ceiling. Someone's purse emptied across 3 rows. And then, during a brief moment, when the screaming passengers quieted slightly, Michelle heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a sound that made her blood run cold. From the overhead bin above row 11 came the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Wait, that can't be right, Michelle thought, her mind refusing to process what her ears were telling her. Babies don't belong in overhead bins. But the crying continued, high-pitched and terrified, clearly audible during the gaps between the roar of turbulence and passenger screams. Other passengers heard it too. Aaron's head snapped up. Is that a baby?" The businessman across the aisle looked up in confusion. "Where is that coming from?" Michelle's training kicked in despite her shock. If there was somehow a baby in an overhead bin, it needed to be retrieved immediately. The turbulence was violent enough to cause serious injury or death. Michelle fought her way forward through the shaking aircraft, grabbing seatbacks for support. She reached row 11 just as the overhead bin above it burst fully open, luggage tumbling out. Michelle threw her arms up to protect herself, and that's when she saw it. Between the falling bags wrapped in blankets, a small child, a toddler, tumbling forward. As the bin's contents spilled, Michelle's hands shot up instinctively, catching the child before he could fall to the floor. She pulled him against her chest, shielding him with her body as a suitcase crashed down where he would have landed. The cabin erupted in shocked gasps and screams. "There's a baby in the overhead bin," someone shouted. "Oh my God, who put a baby up there?" Lisa Martinez sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of terror and shame, knowing her secret was exposed, knowing the consequences were about to crash down on her, harder than any turbulence. Michelle held the crying, trembling toddler, her mind reeling. How? Why? Who? The child was real, solid, alive in her arms, whimpering in fear. This wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately placed this baby in the overhead compartment. Captain James Morrison heard Michelle's urgent voice on the intercom through his headset. "Captain, we have an emergency. I found a child, a toddler, in an overhead bin. Repeat, a child was hidden in the overhead compartment. Child appears uninjured but extremely distressed. We need medical evaluation and law enforcement on arrival." James's hands tightened on the controls. In 30 years of flying, he'd never heard of anything like this. "Copy that. Descending and requesting priority landing. Medical and law enforcement will meet the aircraft." Michelle carried the child toward her jump seat, still protecting him from the turbulence that continued to shake the plane. "Whose child is this?" she called out to the cabin. "Someone identify this child right now." Silence. No one claimed him. Michelle's eyes scanned the passengers and landed on Lisa Martinez, still sitting rigid in 11C, tears streaming down her face, directly below where the child had been hidden. "Ma'am," Michelle said, her voice hard, "is this your son?" Lisa couldn't speak. She just nodded, sobbing. The cabin exploded in angry reactions. "You put your baby in the overhead bin? What kind of monster are you? That child could have died." Michelle held up a hand for silence, her priority the child's safety, not passenger judgment. "Everyone quiet. The child is safe now. That's what matters." She strapped into her jump seat with the toddler held securely against her, using her own body as a shield while the turbulence continued. The boy's crying had quieted to whimpers as he clung to Michelle, perhaps sensing safety despite the chaos around him. You won't believe what was going through Lisa's mind in those moments. Shame, guilt, fear of arrest, but also a desperate need to explain, to make someone understand that she wasn't a monster, that she'd been desperate, that she'd made a terrible choice because she'd felt she had no other options. When the turbulence finally subsided and the captain announced it was safe to move about the cabin, Lisa unbuckled and fell to her knees in the aisle beside Michelle's jump seat. "Please," she sobbed, "please let me explain. I know what I did was wrong, but I was desperate. I had to get away. I couldn't afford another ticket. I didn't know what else to do." Michelle's expression was a mixture of anger, disgust, and professional restraint. She wanted to scream at this woman, to shake her and demand what kind of person risks their own child's life like this. But she also saw genuine anguish in Lisa's face, and her training reminded her that judgment wasn't her job right now. Safety and care were. "Sit down, ma'am," Michelle said coldly. "We'll discuss this on the ground with law enforcement." She turned to her colleague, Marcus, who'd come forward. "Get medical assessment started on the child. Check for any injuries from the turbulence." Marcus, who had paramedic training, gently examined little Christopher while Michelle held him. Miraculously, aside from being terrified and probably dehydrated from crying in the confined space, the boy seemed physically unharmed. "No obvious injuries," Marcus reported, "but he needs proper medical evaluation. Oxygen levels seem okay, but being in that bin for 90 minutes, he didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew how dangerous it had been. The overhead bin wasn't pressurized properly, wasn't ventilated adequately, was never designed for a living being. The child had survived through sheer luck." Aaron watched this scene unfold with horror and disbelief. He pulled out his phone and started documenting notes for what he knew would become an important story. But he also felt overwhelming empathy for the child, and anger at the mother whose desperation had led to such a dangerous choice. Around him, other passengers expressed similar feelings. Some demanded the mother be arrested immediately. Others, particularly a few women who seemed to recognize something in Lisa's desperation, counseled compassion alongside accountability. Captain Morrison diverted to Denver, the nearest major airport with full medical and law enforcement facilities. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an unscheduled landing in Denver due to the emergency situation. We'll be on the ground in 20 minutes. Please remain calm and seated. Medical personnel and authorities will board upon arrival." The cabin was subdued now, the adrenaline of crisis giving way to exhaustion and stunned processing of what had happened. During the descent, Lisa sat in her seat crying quietly while Michelle continued holding Christopher, who'd finally fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted from his ordeal. Michelle looked down at the sleeping child and felt her anger warring with pity. How desperate must this mother have been to think putting her child in an overhead bin was a reasonable choice? But how could desperation override basic maternal instinct to protect your child? Michelle had her own children at home, and she couldn't imagine any circumstance that would lead her to risk their lives like this. The plane landed in Denver to waiting ambulances and police cars. Medical personnel boarded first, carefully taking Christopher from Michelle's arms and placing him on a small gurney for transport to the hospital. Lisa tried to follow, but police officers stopped her. "Ma'am, you're being detained for questioning regarding child endangerment." Lisa collapsed into hysterical crying. "Please let me go with him. He needs me. He'll be scared without me." One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes but firm voice, responded. "The child is being taken to the hospital for evaluation. You'll be transported to the police station. Your cooperation will be noted." As Lisa was led off the plane in handcuffs, crying and looking back at her son, Aaron saw something in other passengers' faces that surprised him. Yes, there was anger and judgment, but there was also sadness. Several women were crying, clearly imagining themselves in Lisa's position, wondering what desperation feels like, what it takes to make a mother believe her only option is to hide her child in a luggage compartment. One elderly woman said quietly to no one in particular, "That poor woman. What hell was she running from?" That this seemed like the answer. The investigation that followed revealed the full story. Lisa Martinez had been in an abusive relationship with Christopher's father, Ramon Cruz, for 5 years. He'd become increasingly violent, particularly after Christopher was born. Lisa had tried to leave multiple times, but Ramon always found her, threatened her family, forced her back. 3 weeks before the flight, Ramon had beaten Lisa so severely she'd been hospitalized. Child Protective Services had gotten involved, threatening to take Christopher if Lisa didn't leave the abusive situation permanently. But here's what made Lisa's situation even more desperate. Ramon was a police officer. He had connections, resources, the ability to track Lisa through official channels. She'd tried going to a domestic violence shelter, but somehow Ramon found out and showed up there, forcing her to leave. She'd tried staying with friends, but he'd threatened them until they asked her to go. She'd reported him to his department, but the blue wall of protection meant minimal consequences for Ramon. Lisa felt she had no allies, no resources, and nowhere to turn within the Los Angeles area. When her sister in New York offered to take her in, Lisa saw it as her only escape. But she had no money. The abuse had isolated her from employment, from savings, from financial independence. She could barely afford one plane ticket for herself using her sister's credit card. There was no way to get a ticket for Christopher too. And driving across country in her car meant Ramon could track her through toll cameras and gas station charges. She felt trapped. Then, in a moment of panic desperation, she'd had the terrible idea, what if she could smuggle Christopher onto the plane? Just hide him until they were safely in New York. It would only be 5 hours. He'd be wrapped in blankets. He'd probably sleep. It would work. It had to work. The magnitude of how badly that plan could have gone wrong became clear during the investigation. Medical experts testified that the overhead bin environment was extremely dangerous for a child. Limited air circulation, pressure changes, no supervision. Christopher could have suffocated, could have been injured when turbulence caused luggage to shift, could have been crushed when the bin burst open. If Michelle hadn't caught him when he fell, the impact to the floor during turbulence could have been fatal. Lisa's desperate plan had been a hair's breadth from killing her own child. The prosecutor faced a difficult decision. On one hand, Lisa had clearly endangered her child in an inexcusable way. The law required accountability. On the other hand, Lisa was a domestic violence victim who'd been systematically isolated and stripped of resources by her abuser. Context mattered. Intent mattered. The prosecutor consulted with domestic violence advocates, child welfare experts, and the judge assigned to the case. They crafted a resolution that balanced accountability with compassion. Lisa pleaded guilty to child endangerment. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended pending completion of 5 years probation, mandatory parenting classes, domestic violence counseling, and regular wellness checks by Child Protective Services. Christopher was placed temporarily with Lisa's sister in New York under CPS supervision. Lisa would join them there after completing intensive counseling and demonstrating she could parent safely. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it acknowledged the complexity of the situation. A desperate woman making a catastrophically bad choice while fleeing genuine danger. But this is where the story takes another turn. Ramon Cruz, Christopher's father and Lisa's abuser, was finally investigated properly after the plane incident made national news. Media attention on Lisa's case prompted Ramon's police department to take a hard look at his history. They discovered multiple complaints from other women that had been dismissed or minimized. They found evidence Ramon had been using his position to stalk and intimidate Lisa, accessing law enforcement databases to track her movements. Ramon was fired, charged with domestic abuse, stalking, misuse of law enforcement systems, and multiple other crimes. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Michelle Park struggled emotionally after the incident. She'd saved Christopher's life by catching him when he fell, but she couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been to tragedy. What if the turbulence had been seconds earlier or later? What if she'd been in a different part of the cabin? What if she hadn't heard the crying? The randomness of survival haunted her. She took a month off from flying to process the trauma and attend counseling. Eventually, she returned to work, but the incident had changed her. She was more vigilant now, more aware that passengers sometimes carry desperate circumstances onto planes, circumstances that might lead to dangerous choices. Aaron's article about the incident, titled "Desperation at 37,000 Feet, The Mother Who Hid Her Toddler in an Overhead Bin," sparked intense national debate. Some readers condemned Lisa as an unfit mother who should lose custody permanently. Others saw her as a victim of systemic failures, domestic violence systems that didn't protect her, economic systems that left her destitute, police systems that protected their own. The debate was contentious, painful, and necessary. It forced conversations about how we support domestic violence victims, how we prevent desperate circumstances that lead to desperate choices. Domestic violence organizations used Lisa's case to highlight gaps in victim support. Lisa Martinez felt she had no options, one advocate wrote in an op-ed. She'd tried shelters, he found her. She'd tried reporting, his police department protected him. She'd tried staying with friends, he threatened them. When we fail to provide genuine safety and resources for abuse victims, we create desperation. Lisa's choice was horrific, but our systemic failures created the context where that choice seemed reasonable to her. We must do better. Christopher thankfully suffered no lasting physical harm from his ordeal. Psychologically, he was young enough that the trauma would likely not form explicit memories, though child psychologists monitored him for any behavioral effects. He stayed with his aunt in New York, visited regularly by Lisa under CPS supervision. Mother and son were slowly rebuilding their relationship, though Lisa carried profound guilt about the danger she'd exposed him to. "I see his face falling from that overhead bin in my nightmares," Lisa told her counselor. Michelle caught him. But what if she hadn't? "I almost killed my own son trying to save him. I have to live with that." 2 years after the incident, Lisa completed her probation requirements successfully. She'd rebuilt her life in New York, working as a receptionist and living with her sister. Christopher, now 3.5, was thriving under their joint care. CPS recommended Lisa regain full custody, which the court granted. Lisa maintained relationships with domestic violence support groups, both as someone receiving support and as someone offering her story as a cautionary tale about how badly things can go when systems fail abuse victims. Michelle met with Lisa 1 year after the incident, a meeting arranged by a restorative justice program that both women agreed to participate in. They sat across from each other in a mediated session, and Michelle asked the question that had haunted her. "How could you do that to your own child?" Lisa's answer came through tears. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I'd been beaten down for so long, isolated, told I was worthless, that no one would help me, that Ramon would always find me. My sister in New York felt like my only escape, but I had no money. In my panicked mind, hiding Christopher seemed safer than staying in Los Angeles, where Ramon could kill us both. I know that sounds insane. It was insane. But desperation makes you insane." Michelle listened, her anger softening slightly, though not disappearing. "You could have told someone at the airport, asked for help. There are programs, resources." Lisa nodded. "I know that now, but at the time, I trusted no one. Ramon had convinced me that everyone would take Christopher away, that I had no allies, that asking for help meant losing my son forever. He'd spent years making me believe that. And in my broken mind, I believed him. I made a terrible choice. But I made it thinking I was protecting Christopher, not endangering him. I was wrong, so wrong. The mediation didn't resolve everything. How could it? But it gave both women some closure." Michelle could see Lisa's humanity, could understand how trauma and abuse had fractured her judgment. Lisa could express remorse directly to the woman who'd saved her son's life. They parted not as friends but as two women who'd been forever connected by one terrible moment and its aftermath. Michelle returned to flying with slightly more compassion for passengers carrying invisible burdens. Lisa returned to motherhood with determination to never let desperation override her judgment again. Aaron followed the story for years, documenting Lisa's recovery and Christopher's development. 5 years after the incident, Christopher was a healthy, happy 7-year-old with no memory of the flight but aware of the story in age-appropriate terms. "Mommy made a mistake when I was little," he'd explained to people who recognized them from news coverage. "But she fixed it. She's a good mommy now." That simple child's faith in his mother's redemption represented the best outcome anyone could have hoped for from such a horrifying situation. The airline industry implemented new policies after the incident. Flight attendants were trained to inspect overhead bins more carefully during boarding, looking for anything unusual. Weight sensors in some bins were recalibrated to alert crew if unusual weight patterns suggested something other than luggage. It wasn't a perfect system. Determined people could still evade detection, but it added layers of safety. The goal was to prevent anyone from attempting what Lisa had done, while also creating awareness that desperation sometimes led people to dangerous choices. The incident also sparked airline industry discussions about affordability and accessibility. If Lisa had been able to afford a ticket for Christopher, none of this would have happened. Airlines began exploring discounted companion tickets for documented domestic violence survivors fleeing abusive situations. It wasn't implemented universally. Logistics and verification were complicated, but several airlines created pilot programs. The recognition that economic barriers could lead to desperate choices prompted some systemic thinking about how to remove those barriers. 10 years after the incident, Michelle retired from flying. At her retirement party, she spoke about the defining moments of her career. "I've helped deliver babies on planes, administered CPR that saved lives, evacuated aircraft during emergencies. But the moment that changed me most was catching a falling toddler who'd been hidden in an overhead bin. That moment taught me that passengers aren't just customers, they're humans carrying burdens and making choices I can't always understand. My job was never just about service. It was about seeing people, staying alert, being ready when the unthinkable happens. Lisa attended Michelle's retirement party, bringing Christopher, now 11 years old and polite and healthy. Lisa gave a brief speech, thanking Michelle for saving her son's life and for eventually extending understanding when it would have been easier to hold only anger. "You're a hero, Michelle. Not just for catching Christopher, but for later choosing to see me as a human being who'd made a terrible mistake rather than a monster. That grace helped me heal. Thank you." The two women embraced, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Christopher, as he grew older and understood the full story, struggled with complicated feelings about his mother's choice. In therapy, he processed anger that she'd put him in danger, gratitude that Michelle had saved him, and confusion about how to reconcile his loving mother with the woman who'd made such a catastrophic decision. His therapist helped him understand that people are complex, that good people sometimes make terrible choices, especially under extreme duress, and that forgiveness doesn't require condoning the action but rather accepting the person's full humanity. Aaron's final article about Lisa and Christopher's story, published on the 10-year anniversary, focused on redemption and systemic failure. Lisa Martinez made an inexcusable choice that nearly killed her son. That fact cannot be minimized or excused. But she made that choice in a context of systemic failure, domestic violence systems that didn't protect her, economic systems that left her destitute, police systems that protected her abuser. When we create contexts of desperation, we create conditions for desperate choices. Lisa has spent a decade making amends, rebuilding, proving she's more than her worst moment. Her son is healthy and loved. That doesn't erase what happened, but it suggests that accountability can coexist with compassion, that punishment can be paired with support, that we can hold people responsible while also examining the systems that fail them. The article sparked reflection on how society balances individual accountability with recognition of systemic pressures. Lisa had made a choice. She bore responsibility for that choice. But she'd made it in conditions that limited her options and fractured her judgment. Both things were true. The challenge was responding in ways that held her accountable while also addressing the conditions that had led to her desperation. It wasn't simple. It was messy, complicated, requiring nuance that social media and public discourse often resisted. But Lisa's case demanded that nuance. 15 years after the flight, Christopher was 17 and applying to colleges. In his personal essay, he wrote about his unusual story, being the baby hidden in the overhead bin, being saved by a flight attendant's quick reflexes, growing up with a mother working to redeem her worst moment. "My story could be told as tragedy or triumph," Christopher wrote. "The truth is, it's both. My mother made a choice that could have killed me, but she made it trying to save us both from violence. A flight attendant caught me when I fell. My mother caught herself when she'd fallen into desperation. Now I'm here, alive, applying to college, grateful for second chances. Mine, my mother's, everyone's. We're all more than our worst moments. We all deserve the chance to prove that." Michelle read Christopher's essay and cried. That boy, who she'd pulled from a falling overhead bin 15 years ago, was now a thoughtful young man writing about redemption and second chances. Lisa had transformed herself from a desperate woman making a catastrophic choice into a mother who'd fought for stability and given her son a good life. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, struggles, moments of doubt, but they'd made it. That mattered. That was everything. Aaron's final reflection, published alongside Christopher's college essay with his permission, captured the essence of what he'd learned from 15 years of following this story. On a Wednesday evening in 2009, a mother made the worst decision of her life. She hid her toddler in an overhead bin, risking his life in a desperate attempt to escape violence. A flight attendant caught the falling child moments before tragedy. In the aftermath, systems responded. Accountability, support, gradual healing. 15 years later, the child is thriving. The mother has rebuilt her life. The flight attendant has retired with the satisfaction of knowing she made a difference. That's not a neat story with a clear moral. It's messy, complicated, full of failure and grace in equal measure, but it's real, and real is what we have to work with. Real people making real mistakes in real circumstances that sometimes break them. Our job, individually and collectively, is to hold people accountable while also creating conditions where desperation doesn't push them to endanger the people they love. That balance is hard. But cases like Lisa and Christopher's show us why it matters. Flight 617, the plane where it all happened, continued flying for another decade before being retired from service. The overhead bin from row 11 was preserved and donated to a museum exhibit on aviation safety and human behavior. Visitors can see the actual compartment where Christopher spent 90 terrifying minutes, can read the story of his miraculous survival, can reflect on the complicated intersection of desperation, poor judgment, quick thinking, and grace that defined that day. The exhibit doesn't moralize or simplify, it simply presents the facts and asks visitors to consider, what would you have done? How do we prevent desperation? How do we respond when people we love make terrible choices? There are no easy answers, but the questions matter. Lisa Martinez, now 50, occasionally speaks at domestic violence awareness events. She tells her story unflinchingly, not to excuse her choice but to illustrate how abuse distorts judgment and how desperate people make desperate decisions. I almost killed my son, she always begins. I will carry that knowledge forever, but I also know that the man who abused me created the conditions where that seemed like my only option. Both things are true. I'm responsible for my choice, and systems failed me. We need to fix the system so other desperate mothers don't face the impossible choices I faced. And we need to hold people accountable when they endanger their children, even in desperation. Both, always both. Michelle Park, in retirement, volunteers with organizations supporting flight attendants who've experienced traumatic incidents during flights. She knows firsthand how catching a falling toddler, how preventing tragedy, how being in the right place at the right moment can haunt you for years afterward. We're trained for emergencies, she tells younger flight attendants, but nothing really prepares you for the moment when you realize a baby was hidden in an overhead bin. Nothing prepares you for catching a falling child while turbulence throws you around. You just react. Then you spend years processing what you reacted to. That's normal, that's okay. Talk about it. Process it. Don't carry it alone. Christopher plans to study social work in college, specifically focusing on children in crisis situations. I want to help kids whose parents are desperate, he explains. I was that kid once. Someone caught me. Now I want to catch other kids before they're put in situations where they need to be caught. Prevention instead of rescue, you know? His mother cries with pride whenever he talks about his career goals. The boy she almost killed through desperation is becoming a man who'll help prevent other children from facing similar dangers. Redemption, Lisa thinks, looks like your son becoming who he is not, despite what you did, but somehow mysteriously, partly because of surviving what you did. Aaron's book about extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances featured Lisa, Christopher, and Michelle's story prominently. The chapter, titled Overhead Compartment, Desperation, Danger, and Difficult Grace, became the most discussed section. Readers argued about Lisa's culpability, debated whether Michelle should have shown her more compassion sooner, questioned whether the legal system had been too lenient or appropriately merciful. The debates were heated but necessary. Lisa's case forced examination of uncomfortable questions. How desperate is too desperate? When does context excuse choices? How do we balance accountability with compassion? There are no universally satisfying answers, but grappling with the questions makes us more thoughtful, more aware, more human. The overhead bin on Flight 617, where Christopher was hidden, became an unlikely symbol of desperation and survival. It represented the worst of human judgment under extreme pressure. But it also represented the best, the flight attendant who caught a falling child, the systems that eventually provided support, the mother who spent a decade proving she was more than her worst moment, the son who chose understanding over anger. All of that from one terrible decision made in one desperate moment. That's the power of choice for better and worse. That's the power of response, of rescue, of redemption. That's what happened when desperation met turbulence at 37,000 feet, and somehow, impossibly, everyone survived.